The hiss of the flat-top grill was the only company Cora had kept for the last 4 hours. Rain hammered the diner's plate glass windows, turning the empty parking lot into a black, shimmering mirror. Sodium orange from the streetlights bled through the condensation, painting streaks on the worn linoleum. Bleach and burnt coffee. That was the smell of 3 a.m., the smell of her life. She leaned a hip against the counter, the Formica cool through her thin apron, and watched the water sluice down the glass. Another Tuesday. Another $14 in tips, most of it in damp singles. The bell over the door didn't so much jingle as it gave a weary, metallic sigh. An old woman stood there, dripping on the welcome mat. She was a small, bird-boned thing, lost inside a beige dress that was plastered to her skin, its color darkened to a miserable taupe. Her hair, a fine white cloud, had been flattened by the downpour. She clutched a thin, worn purse to her chest like a shield, her knuckles pale and knotted. She didn't move towards a booth. She just stood, a puddle forming around her sensible, soaked shoes, her dark eyes scanning the empty diner with a kind of quiet, desperate dignity. Cora pushed off the counter. The soles of her sneakers squeaked on the floor she'd just mopped. "We're closing up in 30, ma'am." The words were automatic, tired. The woman's eyes, ancient and deep-set, found hers. She said nothing. Her lips were a pale, bloodless line. A shiver racked her small frame, a tremor that seemed to start in her bones. Cora's exhaustion curdled into something else. Something that felt like looking at her own grandmother, if she'd had one who'd made it past 60. She sighed, the sound lost under the drumming of the rain.
"Come on.
Get out of the wet." She gestured with her head toward the nearest booth, the red vinyl cracked and patched with silver duct tape. The old woman hesitated, then moved with a slow, shuffling grace, as if each step cost her something. She slid into the booth, her wet dress making a faint peeling sound against the seat. She placed her purse on the table with deliberate care, her hands trembling slightly. Cora grabbed a coffee pot from the warmer. It was old, sludgy, the dregs of the night. She poured a cup anyway, the black liquid steaming in the cool air. She set it on the table. On the house, the woman looked at the cup, then back at Cora. A flicker of something, maybe gratitude, maybe just surprise, moved in her dark eyes. She wrapped her frail, cold fingers around the warm ceramic. Cora went back behind the counter. She pulled 2 slices of rye from the bag, buttered them, and layered on slices of ham and Swiss she knew her boss, Sal, would count in the morning. She'd cover it. She always did. The sandwich sizzled on the grill, the smell of melting cheese and warm bread momentarily winning the war against the bleach. She plated it, cut it in half, and carried it over. She set the plate next to the coffee. The woman stared at the food, her expression unreadable. Then, she picked up half the sandwich with a slow, deliberate motion. She brought it to her lips and took a small, careful bite. Her eyes closed. Just for a second. When they opened again, they were fixed on Cora. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Cora pretended not to see it. She just grabbed a rag and started wiping down the already clean counter. The rain fell harder. The bell sighed again, this time with a violent shove that sent the door crashing against its stopper. 2 men filled the entrance, big and loud, shaking rain from their leather jackets like wet dogs. They smelled of damp wool and cheap whiskey. The shorter one, thick-necked and florid, grinned, showing a gold tooth. The taller one had a long, horsey face and eyes that roamed the empty diner with a predatory boredom. They stomped over to the counter, their heavy boots scuffing the clean floor. "Coffee," the short one grunted, slapping a wet $20 bill down. "And keep it coming, sweetheart." Cora's hand tightened on her rag. She hated being called sweetheart. She turned, met his watery eyes, and said nothing. She poured 2 mugs, her movements economical and stiff. The men took their coffee and swaggered to a booth directly behind the old woman. They were loud, their laughter echoing in the small space. Cora could feel the vibrations through the floor. She watched them from the corner of her eye as she refilled the salt shakers. They weren't eating. They were watching. The old woman, Sophia, ate her sandwich in small, methodical bites, as if she hadn't noticed them. But her back was rigid. The set of her narrow shoulders was a straight, tense line. The short man leaned forward, his voice a stage whisper that carried easily. "Hey, Nana, you got a light?" Sophia didn't turn. She took a slow sip of her coffee. The tall one snickered. "She don't speak English, dummy." Probably fresh off the boat, he switched to a clumsy, mocking Italian, the words thick and wrong. "Accendino, signora?" "Fine, Mifri." His friend howled with laughter. Cora felt a hot, familiar anger uncoil in her gut. It was the same anger she felt when Sal shorted her hours, or when her landlord tacked on another late fee. A tired, grinding rage. She walked over to their booth, the coffee pot held low in one hand. "Leave her alone," the short man looked up, his grin widening. "What's it to you?" "She your grandma?" "She's a customer," Cora said, her voice flat. "And you're disturbing her." The tall one leaned back, stretching his arms along the top of the vinyl seat. His hand brushed against the back of Sophia's head. The old woman flinched, a tiny, sharp movement. "We're just being friendly," he said, his eyes lingering on Cora's name tag. "Right, Cora?" That was it. That was the line. Using her name. Making it personal. She felt the heat of the coffee pot in her hand. The weight of it. She took a steadying breath. "Get out!" The short man's grin vanished. He started to slide out of the booth, his bulk rising. "What did you say?" The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of something ugly. The rain beat a frantic rhythm against the glass. Sophia had stopped eating. Her hands were still, resting on the table on either side of her plate. Her eyes were closed again, but this time it didn't look like relief. It looked like prayer. The door opened without a sound. It was the silence that was wrong. The bell should have announced him, but it didn't. One moment the doorway was empty, framing the rain-slicked asphalt. The next he was there. He wasn't large like the other two, but he took up all the space. He wore a dark, tailored suit that should have been soaked but wasn't. Drops of water seemed to hesitate on the fine wool before sliding away without a trace. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly at odds with the greasy, worn-down diner. His face was sharp angles and shadows, his black hair slicked back from his forehead. He didn't look at Cora. He didn't look at the two men, who had frozen mid-motion. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, were fixed on the old woman. He walked toward her booth, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the linoleum. The short man, who had been halfway to his feet, sank back into his seat. The tall one's sneer had evaporated, leaving his face slack with confusion, then a dawning, sickly recognition. The man stopped beside the booth. He placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder, a gesture of impossible gentleness. He spoke, and his voice was low, calm, the Italian flowing from him not as a mockery, but as a piece of his own architecture.
"Mamma, stai bene?"
Sophia opened her eyes. She looked up at him, and her entire body seemed to soften, the tension draining out of her like water. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. A silent conversation passed between them in a single glance. He straightened up, his pale eyes finally sweeping over the two men in the booth behind her. There was no anger in his expression. There was nothing. It was a terrifying, absolute blankness. "You," he said, his English precise, accented. He pointed a long finger at the tall man. "Your hand. You touched her head with it." The tall man stared at his own hand, as if it were a foreign object. He started to stammer. We were just no disrespect." The man in the suit, Marco, tilted his head slightly.
"No disrespect."
"I see." He took a step closer to their booth. The air crackled. The diner, which had felt empty and cavernous, now felt claustrophobically small, a cage with 4 occupants and a predator. Cora stood frozen by the counter, the coffee pot still in her hand. Its heat was a distant, unimportant fact. Her own breathing sounded loud, ragged in the sudden, crushing silence. The only other sounds were the rain and the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Marco looked at the short man.
"And you?"
"What did you say?" The man swallowed hard, his face clammy with sweat. "Nothing." "I said nothing. Marco's gaze drifted to the half-eaten sandwich on Sophia's plate, then to Cora behind the counter. His eyes held hers for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a look of thanks or acknowledgement. It was an assessment, a weighing. Then he turned his attention back to the men. "You will apologize to my mother." The silence stretched, thin and tight. The tall man licked his lips. "Look, pal, we didn't mean nothing by it." Marco's expression didn't change. It was like watching a statue. That was not an apology. He took another step, placing him directly beside their table. He moved with a horrifying economy, no wasted energy. He was a study in potential energy, a coiled spring. The short man, emboldened by a fatal surge of whiskey-fueled pride, pushed his chest out. "We ain't apologizing to nobody." It happened faster than Cora could process. Marco's hand moved, a blur of dark wool. It wasn't a punch. It was a strike. His knuckles connected with the side of the short man's jaw, with a sound like a dry branch snapping. The man's head hit the wall with a wet thud, and his eyes rolled back. He slumped sideways in the booth, unconscious before his body finished falling. The tall man scrambled to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. He fumbled inside his jacket, pulling out a cheap switchblade. The blade caught the greasy fluorescent light. Marco didn't even look at the knife. His gaze was fixed on the man's face. "A mistake," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. He moved inside the man's clumsy lunge. There was a swift, brutal choreography to it. A block, a twist. The knife clattered to the floor. Marco's right hand shot out, fingers stiff, and jabbed into the man's throat. The man made a choked, gurgling sound, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He staggered back, clutching his neck, his legs giving out. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping like a landed fish. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The sudden, violent eruption was followed by an even more profound silence. The only movement was the man on the floor, twitching. Blood, dark and thick, began to pool on the white and black tiles. It seeped into the grout lines Cora had scrubbed clean just an hour ago. Marco stood over him, breathing evenly. He looked down at the man, his expression one of faint disappointment, as if he'd expected a more interesting problem to solve. He adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve, a small, precise movement. Then he bent down and picked up the switchblade, holding it delicately between his thumb and forefinger. He wiped the handle on the unconscious man's jacket before tucking it into his own pocket. He turned. His pale eyes met Cora's again. She was still holding the coffee pot. Her knuckles were white. Her heart was a frantic hammer against her ribs. He looked at the mess on the floor. The blood. The overturned chair. The unconscious man in the booth. "I will pay for the damages," he said, as if discussing a broken plate. His mother, Sophia, was calmly eating her sandwich. She took another small, neat bite, seemingly unbothered by the violence that had just unfolded inches from her back. She was in his world now, a world that had just bled all over Cora's floor. Cora finally found her voice, though it came out as a raw croak. "You can't, he's..." She gestured vaguely at the man on the floor, who was now making quiet, hitching noises. Marco followed her gaze, his expression unconcerned. "He will live." Unfortunately, he walked over to his mother's booth and slid in opposite her. He spoke to her in soft, rapid Italian, his voice a low murmur. She replied in kind, her tone placid. She gestured with a corner of her sandwich toward Cora. Marco nodded, then looked back at Cora. "My mother says you were kind to her." Kindness seemed like a word from another language now, a concept that didn't belong in the same room as the smell of blood and fear. Cora swallowed, the coffee pot feeling impossibly heavy. She set it down on the counter with a clatter. She was wet and hungry, a simple transaction, Marco said, though it wasn't a question. "But you did not charge her." Cora's chin jutted out, a familiar, stubborn reflex. "I'll cover it." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Marco's lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "I am sure you will." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, the same one that now held the switchblade, and pulled out a thick, black leather wallet. He extracted a stack of $100 bills, crisp and new. He fanned them out, and placed them on the table. For the food. For the floor. For your trouble. The money sat on the sticky tabletop, obscene in its casual abundance. It was more than she made in a month. It was her rent, her mother's medical bills, the new alternator her car desperately needed. It was a way out, and it was covered in the invisible filth of what had just happened. She stared at the cash, then at the man who offered it. His stillness was what was most unnerving. He sat there, in a blood-spattered diner, as if he were in a boardroom, completely in command. His world operated on a different set of physics.
Cora shook her head.
I don't want your money, he raised an eyebrow. The slight movement was more expressive than the other men's shouting.
No.
The sandwich is $2.99, she said, her voice tight. The coffee is $1.50. You can leave $5 on the table. He watched her for a long moment, his pale eyes searching her face. He seemed to find something there that interested him. He didn't push. He simply nodded slowly, then slid the stack of bills back into his wallet. He pulled out a single, worn $5 bill and placed it neatly beside his mother's plate. His mother finished her sandwich, wiped her mouth with a paper napkin, and gave Cora a small, shy smile. It was a genuine, warm thing, a startling contrast to her son's glacial composure. He helped his mother to her feet. As they walked to the door, he paused. He looked at the two bodies. Someone will be by to clean this up, he said. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement of fact. Then he and his mother were gone, disappearing into the rain as quietly as they had arrived, leaving Cora alone with the hum of the fridge, two broken men, and the spreading pool of blood on her clean floor. The next day, the sun was a weak, watery presence in the sky. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy with moisture. The diner smelled of pine-scented disinfectant, a chemical sharpness layered over the usual odors of grease and coffee. The broken chair was gone. The floor was spotless, the grout whiter than Cora had ever been able to get it. A man had come, as promised, before dawn. He was quiet, efficient, and wore overalls. He hadn't spoken a word to her, just cleaned the mess with an unnerving proficiency, replaced the chair, and left. Sal hadn't even noticed. Cora was working the lunch shift, the diner half full of regulars who talked about sports and the weather. The daylight made everything feel unreal, like the night before had been a fever dream. But the memory of it was a cold knot in her stomach. She could still hear the snap of bone, still see the vacant look in the man's eyes. The bell over the door jingled, a cheerful, mundane sound. It was him.
Marco.
In the light of day, he seemed even more out of place. He wore another impeccably tailored suit, this one a charcoal gray. He had no entourage, no visible weapons, but he carried an aura of authority that made heads turn as he walked to the counter. The chatter in the diner dipped, then resumed at a lower, more cautious volume. He slid onto a stool at the counter, his movements fluid and precise.
Coffee, he said.
His voice was the same, low and calm. It sent a shiver down her spine. Cora's hands were trembling slightly as she picked up a clean mug. She filled it and set it in front of him, her movements stiff. She could feel the eyes of every customer on them. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice clipped. He took a slow sip of the coffee, his pale eyes scanning the diner before settling back on her. "I came to thank you. You paid me," she said, gesturing to the $5 bill from last night, which she'd rung up and put in the till. "The transaction is complete," he ignored that. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a plain white envelope. He slid it across the counter. It was thick with cash. The same offer as before, just repackaged. "This is not a payment," he said. "This is a gift. For your discretion." The word hung in the air between them. Discretion. A pretty name for silence. For pretending she hadn't seen a man nearly killed on her floor. She looked at the envelope, then back at his face. His expression was patient, neutral.
He was used to getting his way.
He was used to a world where money solved problems, erased memories, bought loyalty. Cora pushed the envelope back toward him. "I don't want it," his eyes narrowed slightly. "Everyone wants money. I want to finish my shift, go home, and forget I ever saw you. It was a lie." She would never forget. The image of the blood on the tiles was burned into her mind. But pride was the only weapon she had, a flimsy shield against a world she didn't understand. That may be difficult, he said, his voice dropping a fraction. The men from last night, they have friends. They are not sophisticated people. They may not appreciate the distinction between who is involved and who is simply present. The threat was delivered calmly, a simple statement of fact, which made it all the more terrifying. He wasn't threatening her. He was explaining the new, dangerous shape of her world. A cold dread seeped into Cora's bones, heavier than the exhaustion she always carried. He wasn't trying to scare her. He was informing her of a reality that now included her. Her life, with its predictable miseries of bills and bad tips, had been predictable. Safe in its own way. Now, the membrane had been punctured. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because my mother has taken an interest in you," Marco said, as if this explained everything. "She believes we owe you a debt." He pushed the envelope a few inches closer. "Take the money. Go somewhere else for a while. A vacation, a vacation." The word was so absurd, so foreign, it almost made her laugh. Where would she go? Her world consisted of this diner, her cramped apartment, and the bus route between them. His solution was to erase her from the equation, to sweep her away like the blood on the floor. The anger returned, hot and sharp, burning through the fear. It was the injustice of it. Her only crime had been to give a cold old woman a sandwich. And now her life was collateral damage in a war she hadn't known existed. "No," she said, the word coming out firm. Final. She looked him directly in the eye. "This is my job. This is my town. I'm not running because you brought your garbage into my diner." For the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise showed on his face. He studied her, his head tilted. It wasn't the reaction he was used to. Fear, greed. Those were the currencies he traded in. Stubborn, working-class pride was an anomaly. "Your pride is a dangerous thing, Cora," he said, using her name again. It felt different this time. Less like an invasion, more like a warning. "It's all I have," she shot back. He held her gaze for a long moment, the sounds of the diner fading into a dull roar. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. He picked up the envelope, the gesture an admission of a temporary defeat. He stood, placing a $10 bill on the counter for the coffee. "As you wish," he turned and walked out, the bell jingling his departure. The diner's normal volume rushed back in to fill the void he left behind. Sal yelled at her from the kitchen pass-through. "Order up, Cora. Stop flirting with the customers and get to work." Flirting. The word was a bitter joke. She picked up the $10 bill. It was warm from his hand. She felt a profound sense of dread, a certainty that in refusing his help, she had sealed herself into a story she had no idea how to survive. She had drawn a line, and now she had to stand on it, even if the ground beneath her was about to give way. She had chosen her miserable, ordinary world over his. But she had a feeling his world wasn't done with her yet. The feeling proved correct 2 nights later. It was closing time again. The rain had returned, a persistent, miserable drizzle. Cora was out back, wrestling a heavy bag of trash into the dumpster. The alley was dark, lit by a single, flickering bulb above the kitchen door that cast long, distorted shadows. The air smelled of wet garbage and stale grease. She slammed the metal lid of the dumpster shut and turned, wiping her hands on her apron. A car was blocking the alley's exit. A big, dark sedan, its engine off, its windows tinted. Not Marco's car. His was sleek, European. This was a heavy piece of American muscle, dented and mean. A sense of cold, primal fear washed over her. This was what he had warned her about. The friends. She backed away slowly toward the kitchen door, her hand reaching for the handle. The car doors opened. 3 men got out. They weren't like the 2 from the diner. They were bigger, quieter, and their movements had a purpose that the other 2 had lacked. One of them, a man with a shaved head and a thick, scarred neck, held up a hand. "We just want to talk." His voice was rough, like gravel grinding. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs. She fumbled with the doorknob. It was locked. Sal always locked it from the inside at closing. She was trapped. "Talk about what?" she managed to say, her voice shaking. The man took a step forward, his companions fanning out to block any escape. Our friend. The one with the broken jaw. He's very unhappy. Says you were there. Says you watched. I'm a waitress. I watch everyone. Her attempt at defiance sounded pathetic, even to her own ears. The man smiled, a slow, ugly stretching of his lips. You saw the guy who did it. The one with the fancy suit. We want a name. A place. Anything you got. He was close now. She could smell the cigarettes on his breath, see the web of broken capillaries on his cheeks. She thought of Marco. His calm, pale eyes. The terrifying efficiency of his violence. And she thought of his mother, Sophia, her gentle, grateful smile. She had given the woman a sandwich. That's where this started. That was the only part of it that was hers. She shook her head. I didn't see anything. I was cleaning the grill. The man's smile vanished. He sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. That's the wrong answer. He lunged. Cora screamed, and threw the only thing she had, a half-empty bottle of industrial cleaner she'd left by the door. It struck him in the chest, splashing pine-scented liquid on his shirt. It only delayed him for a second. He grabbed the front of her uniform, his knuckles digging into her collarbone. He slammed her back against the brick wall of the diner. The impact knocked the wind out of her, her head cracking against the rough surface. Stars exploded behind her eyes. He leaned in close, his face inches from hers. Let's try this again. Pain flared across her scalp. Her vision swam. The rough texture of the brick scraped her back. The man's grip was like an iron band, crushing the air from her lungs. She could feel the other two closing in, their shadows swallowing the weak light from the bulb. This was it. This was how it ended. In a filthy alley behind a diner, over a $2 sandwich. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, blindingly bright. They pinned the men in a harsh, white glare, freezing them like animals caught on a highway. A car door opened and closed with a solid, expensive thud. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. Marco emerged from the glare, a silhouette in a dark coat. He wasn't hurrying. He moved with the same deliberate calm as always, as if he were walking into a business meeting. The man holding Cora let out a string of curses and shoved her away. She stumbled, her knees giving out, and fell to the wet asphalt. He turned to face Marco. Well, look who it is. We were just asking your girlfriend here where to find you. Marco stopped about 10 feet away. The headlights behind him cast his shadow long and sharp across the alley. She is not my girlfriend, he said, his voice cutting through the night air. And you will not touch her again. The man with the shaved head laughed, a harsh, barking sound. There's 3 of us, one of you, pretty boy. He pulled a tire iron from the waistband of his jeans. His friends did the same, producing a pipe and a heavy chain. They spread out, a slow, confident semicircle. Marco didn't even glance at their weapons. His pale eyes were fixed on the leader. Your math is correct, Marco said. Your conclusion, however, is flawed. He shrugged off his coat, letting it fall to the ground. He was in his shirt sleeves now, the white cuffs stark against the darkness. He moved. It wasn't a fight. It was a dismantling. He flowed between them, a ghost in the headlights. There was the sickening crack of the tire iron hitting an arm that was no longer there, followed by a scream of pain. The pipe swung, and Marco was inside the swing, a series of short, devastating strikes to the man's ribs and throat. The third man, the one with the chain, hesitated. It was his undoing. Marco closed the distance, took the chain from him, and used it with a brutal, whipping efficiency. It was all motion and sound. The thud of bodies hitting the ground, the choked gasps of pain, the sharp crack of bone. Cora watched from the ground, her head throbbing. She saw it not as a brawl, but as a series of precise, calculated solutions to a set of physical problems. In under a minute it was over. The 3 men were on the ground, groaning, broken. Marco stood in the center of the alley, breathing easily. He looked down at the man with a tire iron, whose arm was bent at an unnatural angle. Tell your friends, Marco said, his voice dangerously soft, that this diner and the girl who works in it are mine. If anyone comes here again, I will burn your entire world to the ground. He turned and walked to where Cora was huddled on the ground. He bent down, offering her a hand. His hand was clean, unmarked. She stared at it, then up at his face. His expression was grim, the blankness replaced by a cold, controlled fury.
I told you, he said.
Your pride is a dangerous thing. She didn't take his hand. She used the brick wall to pull herself up, her legs shaking. Her whole body ached. The back of her head was wet and sticky. When she touched it, her fingers came away dark with blood. The reality of her situation settled on her like a shroud. The alley, the broken men, Marco standing there like some avenging angel from a much darker Bible. This wasn't a story she was watching. It was her life. And it was ruined. They'll come back, she said, her voice hollow. Or others will. No, he said with absolute certainty. They will not. He picked up his coat from the gravel, shaking it out. He looked at the kitchen door, then at the wreckage of the men on the ground, then at her. You cannot stay here. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a verdict. Her world, the one she had clung to so stubbornly, had been officially condemned. The diner wasn't safe. Her apartment wasn't safe. The 5-block radius of her life had been contaminated by his. All for a sandwich. I have nowhere to go, she whispered, the fight finally draining out of her. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary terror. He stepped closer, his pale eyes searching her face in the harsh glare of the headlights. He saw the cut on her head, the terror in her eyes, the way she trembled. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his gaze. It might have been regret. It might have been possession. Yes, you do, he said quietly. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently push a stray strand of hair from her face, his fingers brushing her temple. The touch was light, almost tender, and it was the most terrifying thing that had happened all night. It was an act of ownership. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had claimed her. The choice she thought she had made in the diner, to refuse his world, had been an illusion. His world had come for her anyway. He opened the passenger door of his car. The interior was dark leather and smelled of something clean and expensive. It was a portal to another life, one she didn't want. But the alley held only pain and the promise of more. The siren started in the distance, a faint, rising wail. Someone must have called the cops. Marco's expression didn't change. He simply waited. The choice was clear. A future she couldn't control, or a present that would swallow her whole. Her knees felt weak. The smell of bleach and burnt coffee seemed a lifetime away. She took a step, then another. She slid into the leather seat. It was cool against her skin. He closed the door, the sound a solid, final click. He got in the driver's side, the engine turning over with a low, powerful hum. As they pulled out of the alley, leaving the broken men and the flickering light behind, the rain began to fall again, streaking across the windshield, washing the old world away. Cora looked back at the diner one last time. Through the rear window, she could see the back door slightly ajar. Her mop was leaning against the wall just inside, right where she'd left it. Her anchor, left behind on a shore she could never return to.